His name was Argos, not because anyone cared enough to choose it with meaning, but because someone needed to write something in the registry when he was born.
We should move
Years
this one
later,
to the
nobody
south
used that
pasture
name
tomorrow.
anymore. Argos had
looks ready
become known
enough.
only by a detail that never changed: his age. While other bulls were measured by size or bloodline, Argos was always compared to the calendar hanging on the barn wall. Each winter made his body less interesting. Each season pushed him a little further from the conversations that mattered. There was no anger around him, just silence. The younger bulls received attention, adjustments, wagers. Argos received space, not out of care, but because he still occupied ground. He wasn't a problem. He was something worse. An announced end. Past his time. Not worth it anymore. These phrases were never said to him. They were said about him. And that was enough. Argos still stood firm. His muscles no longer impressed, but they hadn't surrendered either. He watched everything with the calm of someone who understood he wasn't competing for anything anymore. He didn't try to draw attention, didn't react, simply existed. And in that place, existence itself was beginning to look like waste. The ranch stretched across 40 acres of Wyoming grassland, owned by Vernon Whitlock, a third-generation cattle breeder who'd built his reputation on timing. Vernon understood markets, genetics, profit margins. He knew when to buy, when to breed, and most importantly, when to let go. Argos had been the pride of Hawthorne Ranch once. 7 years ago, he'd commanded stud fees that made Vernon's competitors envious. His offspring dominated regional shows. Buyers from 3 states requested his genetics. Back then, Vernon would walk visitors past other bulls just to watch their expressions change when they saw Argos. Massive, powerful, undeniable. But the industry moved in cycles shorter than a bull's lifespan. New bloodlines emerged. Younger animals carried genes modified for faster growth, leaner meat, better temperament. Science refined what nature had given Argos, then packaged it in bodies that wouldn't age as quickly. At 12 years old, Argos had become what the industry called retired stock, a polite term for obsolete. Vernon didn't mistreat him. Hawthorne Ranch wasn't that kind of operation. Argos received adequate feed, shelter from weather, basic veterinary care. But he no longer received purpose. He stood in a back paddock where visitors weren't taken, where the newer bulls couldn't see him and remember they too would eventually grow old. The ranch hands barely acknowledged him during daily rounds. Feed got delivered. Water got checked. Nobody stopped to scratch behind his ears or speak the way they did with the younger animals. Argos had transitioned from asset to inventory, waiting for the practical moment when space and feed costs would finally outweigh the small mercy of letting him continue breathing. When the notice arrived about the state inspection, Vernon felt the usual tightening in his chest. Inspections meant paperwork, compliance verification, someone poking through records looking for violations that could cost him licensing. The state took agricultural standards seriously, and Chief Inspector Nolan Avery had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. Vernon spent 3 days preparing. He organized health records, vaccination logs, breeding documentation. He had the main barns cleaned twice. He briefed his staff on what to say, what not to volunteer, how to appear competent without seeming defensive. Nobody mentioned Argos specifically. He wasn't worth the attention. Nolan Avery arrived on a Thursday morning in a state vehicle that looked like it had driven through every county in Wyoming without stopping for a wash. He was in his late 50s, built like someone who'd spent more time in barns than offices, with steel gray hair and eyes that didn't waste energy on pleasantries. He didn't shake Vernon's hand, didn't comment on the weather or compliment the property. Just pulled out a tablet and said, "Let's start with your breeding stock." The inspection followed a rhythm as cold as Nolan's demeanor. He checked documentation against physical animals, verified ear tags matched registry numbers, examined housing conditions for compliance with space regulations. He asked technical questions Vernon answered correctly because he'd been doing this for 30 years. Everything proceeded exactly as it should: efficient, professional, unremarkable. They covered the main breeding barn, the quarantine area, the feed storage, the veterinary station. Nolan made notes Vernon couldn't read from his angle. The inspector's face revealed nothing. No approval, no concern, just systematic evaluation. Vernon began to relax. The inspection was almost over. Nolan would file his report, Hawthorne Ranch would pass with standard recommendations, and life would continue. Then Nolan stopped walking. They'd reached the back paddocks, the areas Vernon hadn't specifically prepared because nobody ever looked there. Nolan's eyes had fixed on something through the fence rails. Argos stood alone in a quarter-acre enclosure, his massive frame outlined against the brown grass. He wasn't doing anything remarkable, just standing there the way bulls do, chewing cud, watching the sky with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. That one. Nolan's voice carried a flatness that made Vernon's stomach tighten. What's his registry number? Vernon pulled out his phone, scrolling through records. Let me see. A7421. Argos, 12 years old, retired from breeding rotation 2 years ago. Why is he isolated? He's not isolated, we keep the older stock separated. Less stress. They don't compete well with younger bulls. Nolan walked closer to the fence. Argos turned his head slowly, acknowledging the attention without particular interest. The bull's eyes were clear, his breathing steady, his body language neither aggressive nor submissive, just present. His condition? Nolan asked. Healthy. Gets regular vet checks. Feed and water are adequate. He's just old. Nolan stood there for almost a full minute, which felt like 10. His expression revealed nothing. He pulled out his tablet, scrolled through something Vernon couldn't see, then made a notation that lasted longer than any other he'd made all morning. Vernon's mouth went dry. Is there a problem with... When was his last full physical examination? 6 months ago. Everything was normal. We can pull the records if... I'll need those records, along with his complete breeding history, offspring tracking, and current dietary specifications. Nolan's voice remained perfectly level, revealing nothing about whether this was routine or something else entirely. Of course, I can have my office send everything by today. Not a request. Nolan turned away from Argos, walking back toward his vehicle with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout the inspection. Vernon followed, trying to read meaning into silence. At the truck, Nolan finally spoke again. I'll file my preliminary report by Friday. You'll receive official correspondence within 10 business days. About everything? Or specifically about everything? Nolan opened his truck door. Including A7421. He drove away before Vernon could ask what that meant. Vernon stood in the driveway long after the state vehicle disappeared, feeling the particular dread that comes from not knowing what you've done wrong. He walked back to the paddock where Argos stood exactly as before, unchanged, unaware, occupying space that suddenly felt significant for reasons Vernon couldn't identify. The bull looked at him with those calm, ancient eyes, and Vernon realized with uncomfortable clarity that for the first time in 2 years, someone important had actually seen Argos. Not as inventory, not as expired value, but as something that required notation, documentation, follow-up. That night, Vernon couldn't sleep. He kept returning to that moment. Nolan standing at the fence, silent, writing something nobody else could read. The chief inspector's face had revealed nothing. No disapproval. No concern. Just careful, deliberate attention. And somehow, that attention felt more dangerous than any violation notice Vernon had ever received. Because in 12 years of owning Argos, Vernon had grown comfortable with the bull's invisibility, with the understanding that old meant irrelevant, and irrelevant meant safe from scrutiny. But Nolan Avery had looked at Argos and seen something worth recording, something that required official documentation, something that would arrive within 10 business days in correspondence whose contents Vernon couldn't predict. Argos, for his part, remained exactly as he'd always been, standing in his paddock, chewing grass, existing with the patience of something that had long ago stopped expecting anything to change. He didn't know that someone had finally noticed him. He didn't know that notice would become a decision, and he couldn't possibly know that the decision would prove that in an industry built on youth, power, and constant replacement, sometimes the greatest threat to comfortable assumptions comes not from rebellion or failure, but from someone who looks at what everyone else has dismissed and asks one simple question: Why? Vernon sent the records that same afternoon. Every document Nolan had requested arrived via email before sunset. Argos's complete breeding history, offspring tracking, veterinary records dating back 12 years, dietary specifications, even photographs from his prime years when buyers lined up to pay premium fees. No response came back. The silence felt deliberate. Vernon found himself checking his email compulsively, refreshing the inbox every hour like a man waiting for test results that would determine something vital. His wife, Kate, noticed the distraction over dinner that first night. What did the inspector actually say was wrong? Nothing. That's the problem. He just looked at Argos differently than everything else. Maybe he's just thorough. Thorough people ask questions. Nolan just stared and wrote things down. Vernon pushed food around his plate. I've dealt with state inspectors for 20 years. They tell you when something's wrong. They cite regulations, give you correction timelines. This was different. Different how? Vernon struggled to articulate it. Like he was documenting evidence instead of checking compliance. The comparison sent a chill through him even as he said it. Because that's exactly what it had felt like. Not an inspection, but an investigation. And Vernon couldn't identify what crime might have been committed beyond the simple fact of keeping an old bull alive past his commercial usefulness. The next morning, Vernon walked out to Argos's paddock with coffee in hand, something he hadn't done in months. The bull stood near the water trough, his massive head lowered, breath visible in the October cold. He didn't acknowledge Vernon's presence. What did he see in you? Vernon asked aloud, knowing the question was absurd. Argos was just a bull, old, past prime, maintained out of habit more than purpose. There was nothing remarkable about him anymore except the increasingly expensive fact that he continued eating feed and occupying space. But Nolan had seen something, had written something, had requested documentation with an urgency that suggested more than routine procedure. Vernon spent that day doing something he hadn't done in 2 years, actually observing Argos. Not just checking that he had food and water, but watching how he moved, how he held himself, how he interacted with his environment. The bull was old, yes, but he wasn't decrepit. His movements carried weight, but also control. His eyes remained clear and alert. His coat showed the dullness of age, but not neglect. When Vernon tossed fresh hay into the paddock, Argos approached with deliberate steps, selected the best sections, ate with the calm efficiency of an animal that understood his own needs. He looked, Vernon realized with uncomfortable clarity, exactly like what he was. A mature bull who'd simply grown old in an industry that worshipped youth. Nothing wrong. Nothing deficient. Just old. And in Vernon's world, that had always been sufficient reason for irrelevance. By day 3, the waiting had infected the entire ranch. Word had spread among the staff that the state inspector had taken special interest in the old bull in the back paddock. Speculation bloomed like weeds. Marcus, the head ranch hand, had a theory. Maybe there's new regulations about retirement livestock, age limits or something.
Sarah, who handled the books, worried about different implications. What if they're flagging operations that keep animals past economic viability, like we're wasting resources? Tom, the youngest hand, offered the darkest possibility. What if they think keeping him this long is cruel? Like we should have put him down already? Vernon shut down that conversation immediately, but the seed had been planted.
Was there cruelty in letting Argos continue existing without purpose? Had Vernon's small mercy actually been prolonged suffering in ways he'd been too comfortable to recognize? He called the state agricultural office on day 4, trying to sound casual. Just following up on the inspection from last week. Wanted to confirm you received the additional documentation on Registry A7421. The clerk checked records. Yes, we have all materials. They've been forwarded to Inspector Avery's review queue. Any sense of timeline on the official report? Standard processing is 7 to 10 business days from inspection date. You'll receive correspondence when the review is complete. No additional information. No hint of whether the attention Argos received indicated a problem or something else entirely. Just bureaucratic procedure wrapped around a mystery Vernon couldn't penetrate. On day 5, something shifted in how the ranch staff treated Argos. Where before he'd been functionally invisible, feed delivered without comment, water checked mechanically, now people paused at his paddock. Not out of affection, exactly. More like morbid curiosity about something that had suddenly become significant through attention they didn't understand. Marcus brought better hay than usual. Sarah checked his water twice in one morning. Even Tom, who'd suggested euthanasia might be mercy, spent 10 minutes watching Argos from the fence with an expression Vernon couldn't quite read. The bull, for his part, remained unchanged. He ate. He drank. He stood in the autumn sun with the patience of something that had learned waiting was simply what existence looked like when you'd already lived beyond your designated usefulness. Vernon found himself resenting Argos slightly for that patience, for the way the bull seemed completely unbothered by the scrutiny, the speculation, the sudden significance assigned to his continued breathing. Argos didn't know that his fate was being decided in some state office by a man who'd looked at him for 2 minutes and seen something nobody else could identify. Or maybe Argos did know, and simply understood that nothing he could do would change whatever conclusion was being formed. Maybe that's what 12 years of life taught you. That survival wasn't about effort or worthiness. It was about whether the people who controlled your existence decided you were allowed to continue occupying space. On day 6, Vernon received an email that made his blood pressure spike. The subject line read, Hawthorne Ranch inspection. Additional information required. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The message was brief, formal, and revealed nothing. Inspector Avery requires supplementary documentation regarding Registry A7421. Please provide complete progeny tracking, including current location and commercial status of all registered offspring. Response required within 48 hours. Vernon read it 3 times, trying to extract meaning from the clinical language. Why did Nolan need to know where Argos' offspring were and how they'd performed commercially? What did 12-year-old breeding history have to do with a standard livestock inspection? He spent the next 8 hours compiling the requested information. It wasn't difficult. Argos had sired 43 registered calves over his productive years. Vernon tracked each one through sale records, show results, breeding contracts. The data painted a picture of remarkable genetic success. Argos' offspring had dominated regional competitions for 5 consecutive years. Several had themselves become valuable breeding stock. 2 had set auction records. In every measurable way, Argos' genetics had proven exceptional, but genetics didn't matter when the body carrying them grew old. Vernon sent the supplementary documentation before the deadline, then spent another sleepless night wondering what pattern Nolan was trying to establish. Excellence in the past didn't erase obsolescence in the present. Success of offspring didn't restore value to an aged parent. The industry had always understood this separation. You could appreciate what an animal had contributed while still recognizing when that contribution had expired. Couldn't you? On day 7, Vernon stood at Argos' paddock just before sunset, watching the bull settle into his evening routine. Argos moved to the shelter of the 3-sided barn, positioned himself against the back wall where wind couldn't reach, and lowered his massive body to the ground with careful deliberation. His eyes closed slowly, and within minutes his breathing had steadied into the rhythm of sleep. He looked in that moment like exactly what he was. Tired, old, and content to simply rest. Vernon felt something crack in his chest. Not quite guilt, but close. For 2 years he'd looked at Argos and seen expired inventory. An asset that had depreciated to near zero value, maintained only because the cost of disposal felt worse than the cost of continued feeding. But Nolan had looked at Argos and seen something that required documentation, investigation, official review. Had seen something significant enough to delay a routine inspection report. Had seen something Vernon, in his comfortable efficiency, had stopped looking for entirely. What if the greatest failing wasn't keeping Argos alive past his commercial usefulness? What if it was deciding that commercial usefulness was the only measure that mattered? Vernon's phone buzzed with a new email. The notification banner showed the sender, Wyoming Department of Agriculture, Office of Chief Inspector. His hand hesitated over the screen. Whatever Nolan had decided, whatever conclusion had been drawn from all that documentation and careful observation, was contained in the message waiting to be opened. Vernon took a breath, looked one more time at Argos sleeping peacefully in his paddock, and opened the email. The subject line read, Hawthorne Ranch, official inspection determination. And what Vernon read in those first 3 lines would prove that sometimes the cruelest thing an industry can do isn't ending something with purpose. It's allowing something to continue without it. But it would also prove that one person's attention, applied at exactly the right moment, could expose a truth everyone else had learned to ignore. The question wasn't whether Argos deserved to continue existing. The question was why everyone had stopped asking that question at all. Vernon read the email 3 times before the words registered. Registry A7421, Argos, designated for Wyoming Heritage Livestock Preservation Program under State Code 47-3-1104. Mandatory compliance required. His hands went numb. Heritage preservation. That program was for historical breeds, rare genetics, cultural significance. Not old bulls everyone had forgotten. The email continued. Subject animal demonstrates genetic value exceeding commercial parameters. Progeny analysis indicates superior traits consistently transmitted. Age does not diminish historical contribution or research potential. Research potential. At 12 years old, Hawthorne Ranch required to maintain enhanced welfare standards, provide quarterly health documentation, ensure state genetic archiving access. Non-compliance results in seizure and relocation. The final line hit hardest. Subject animal represents irreplaceable genetic resource. Commercial age limitations do not supersede preservation value. Designation is permanent. Vernon set his phone down carefully. Nolan hadn't condemned Argos, hadn't ordered euthanasia, had done something more disruptive, declared him officially valuable. Not despite his age. Because of it. Kate found him 20 minutes later, staring at the screen. What did it say? They're protecting him, the state, making Argos a heritage preservation animal. What does that mean? Vernon laughed, slightly unhinged. It means I can't sell him, can't retire him, have to keep him alive and documented. He looked at her. Nolan decided the industry was wrong. Kate was quiet. Were we wrong? Vernon thought about Argos standing invisible for 2 years, dismissed, waiting for a decision everyone assumed would be practical. Yeah, he said. We were. That afternoon, Vernon walked to Argos's paddock with the email on his phone. The bull stood chewing grass, unaware his status had shifted from obsolete to protected heritage. You won, Vernon said quietly. Didn't know you were fighting, but you won. Argos looked at him with ancient, patient eyes, and Vernon understood. The bull never needed to win. He just needed someone to ask different questions. Not, what's he worth, but what has he given? And that question changed everything. The state geneticist arrived Tuesday with equipment Vernon didn't recognize. Dr. Elena Marsh spent 3 hours with Argos, taking samples, measurements, photographs. His cellular markers are remarkable, she said, reviewing her tablet. 12 years old, but genetic stability reads like 6. Know what that means? Vernon shook his head. Whatever made Argos exceptional wasn't breeding luck. It's inherent, something we can study. Elena looked at the bull with reverence. He's a genetic baseline for studies that could influence breeding programs for 20 years. Vernon thought about almost having him put down last spring. That would have been catastrophic to agricultural science, Elena said flatly. He was just old. He was irreplaceable. Age isn't decay, Mr. Whitlock. Sometimes it's refinement. After she left, Vernon stood at Argos's paddock. The bull had been moved to larger enclosure, better shelter, premium feed. State compliance. Marcus approached. Boss, we're getting calls. Other ranchers heard about the designation. 3 operations contacted us. They've got aging stock they were retiring. Now they're wondering if preservation applies to them too. Vernon felt understanding shift. Nolan's decision hadn't just saved Argos. It had asked a question the industry now had to answer. How many valuable genetics had they discarded because age made animals inconvenient? That evening, another email from Nolan. Program expansion consideration. A7421 designation generated significant inquiry. State reviewing criteria for additional candidates. Your cooperation noted. Recommend preparing for industry-wide impact. Vernon read between lines. Nolan had used Argos as test case, had proven age-based obsolescence was institutional laziness, not biological necessity. Now that precedent existed, other operations would demand same scrutiny. The industry built itself on efficiency, rapid turnover, treating animals as interchangeable units measured by current commercial value. Nolan looked at one forgotten bull and exposed the flaw. The system couldn't distinguish between something that stopped being useful and something whose usefulness it stopped measuring. Vernon returned to Argos's paddock. The bulls stood in better shelter, eating better feed, monitored by scientists who saw him as data rather than inventory. "You didn't do anything," Vernon said. "Just stood there being old." Somehow that was enough. Argos chewed grass, patient and unbothered. Vernon finally understood what Nolan saw. Dignity didn't require youth. Value didn't expire on schedule. Sometimes the greatest rebellion was simply refusing to disappear when everyone expected you invisible. Argos stood in his expanded paddock on a spring morning, watching younger bulls graze nearby. He'd outlived expected retirement through simple, patient existence. The ranch had changed. Vernon kept detailed records on aging animals now, noting traits beyond commercial value. When ranchers called about preservation programs, he listened. He recommended Nolan. The state had designated 4 more bulls under heritage protection. Each time, the process began the same, an inspector noticing what everyone else overlooked. Dr. Marsh visited quarterly, her research citing Argos in agricultural journals. Cellular stability in mature breeding stock referenced his registry number 17 times. "You're famous," Vernon told him. "Scientists 3 states away argue about your DNA." Argos chewed grass, unbothered. The real change happened in quiet conversations at auctions, conferences, ranchers admitting they'd discarded animals carrying genetics worth preserving. The industry asking uncomfortable questions. How much had efficiency cost? What irreplaceable knowledge disappeared because age made it inconvenient? Nolan never took credit. His reports remained clinical, revealing nothing of the revolution he'd engineered by simply enforcing a statute nobody knew existed. But Vernon understood. That first inspection, the silence at Argos's paddock, extensive requests, careful notation, hadn't been routine. It was Nolan choosing one forgotten bull as test case for larger truth. That commercial value was one measurement among many, that the important question wasn't, what can he do now, but what is he given, and what happens if we lose that knowledge? On a May afternoon, Vernon watched veterinary students observe Argos. One asked, "What made you keep him when most operations would have retired him years ago?" Vernon considered answers. Pride, sentiment, inertia. "I didn't keep him," Vernon said finally. "He kept himself. I just stopped having authority to decide he shouldn't." The student looked confused. Dr. Marsh smiled, understanding. Later, Vernon stood alone at the fence. Argos settled into evening routine, lowering his body with careful deliberation. "You changed everything," Vernon said quietly. "Just by refusing to disappear when convenient." Argos's eyes closed, breathing steadying into sleep. Vernon understood Nolan's full scope. He hadn't saved one bull. He'd exposed systemic flaw by forcing everyone to see what they'd ignored. That dignity existed independent of productivity. That value persisted beyond utility. The industry humiliated Argos by forgetting him, treating age as obsolescence, deciding his story ended before checking if he was still writing it. But Nolan's final order, permanent heritage designation, transformed humiliation into legacy. Argos would die eventually, but his genetics, his data, his existence as proof that commercial timelines didn't determine biological worth would outlive him. Every time a rancher hesitated before retiring aging stock, every time someone asked, "What does he represent?" instead of, "What does he cost?" Argos's quiet rebellion would echo forward. He hadn't fought, hadn't performed, just existed with patient dignity, while everyone learned to see differently. Sometimes that was the most revolutionary act of all.